Hi everyone, my name is Katherine Fitzgerald and I'm an assistant professor of neurology and epidemiology at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland in the United States. I'm super excited today to be discussing a presentation on environmental exposures and their impact on MS. And I'm going to be specifically focusing on the role of diet. I'm going to be discussing some specific reasons why diet might be important in MS, even though the evidence for some specific diets might be a little bit sparse. So as an outline of what we're going to be discussing today, we're going to review what we know about vitamin D and its influence on MS prognosis. We're going to examine some common MS-related myths related to diet, and we're also going to review what we know about diet in MS, as well as some current studies on fasting style diets and the Mediterranean diet. And then lastly, we're going to provide some tips for eating well and eating easy with MS. So just jumping right in, we're first going to talk about, we're going to review what we know about vitamin D and its influence on MS prognosis. So what is vitamin D? So vitamin D is an essential nutrient that's acquired from sun exposure or from dietary sources. Vitamin D is a hormone that's produced out of cholesterol when your skin is exposed to the sun. Vitamin D helps to maintain strong bones by helping the body absorb minerals like calcium that are needed to build and strengthen bones. Interestingly, it may have a role in the body's immune or the defense system and heart and brain health, which is why we care about it with respect to MS. Where can you get vitamin D? So you can get vitamin D from two primary sources. You can get it from exposure to the sun. So what happens is your skin makes vitamin D when it's exposed to ultraviolet rays from the sun in the summer. Typically only in the summertime is when those rays are strong enough to be able to produce vitamin D. We also know that people with darker skin tend to produce less vitamin D from a sun exposure and may be more likely to have lower vitamin D levels. You can also get vitamin D from food sources, and these food sources include fatty fish, egg yolks, as well as vitamin D fortified foods. So this is just a background of how when you eat vitamin D or you get it from the sun, how it's metabolized and it's metabolized within your body, and we're going to talk a little bit about why this is important, because some of these measures are what are assessed in studies when people look at vitamin D as it relates to MS outcomes. So first, for the first portion, we get vitamin D from the sun or some food sources, and then in the liver, it's converted to what's called 25-hydroxy vitamin D. So this is the primary molecule within your blood that people measure a lot of times when they study vitamin D. However, it's not actually the active component, so it doesn't have any, this metabolite of vitamin D doesn't have any relevance to disease, whereas it's further metabolized in the kidney to what's called 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D, which is the active form of vitamin D. So this component of vitamin D has more immunomodulatory properties. So why are we studying vitamin D as it relates to MS? Why could this hormone that's produced from the sun have any impact on vitamin D? And so these are kind of motivated by some early observations that scientists made that help to motivate future studies. So these include, they noted that in animal models of MS, the mice improved, so their disease severity improved after the administration of vitamin D supplements. They also noted that in people with MS, the relapse rates tend to vary over the course of the year. This is notable since vitamin Ds in your blood are also variable by season, given that at least here in Canada we have 4 seasons, so it's likely, so you get more vitamin D in the summer relative to the winter, and this influences your levels that are circulating in your blood, and this also correlates with the changes in the variability of relapse rate over the course of the year. Lastly, they also noted that the active form of vitamin D has an anti-inflammatory properties and could affect pro-inflammatory immune pathways. And so the active form of vitamin D can impact types of markers produced by immune cells, as well as help reduce some types of immune cells associated with greater. So this previous study motivated future prospective studies. So what I mean by prospective studies is measuring vitamin D levels and then looking as to the future for how they could influence future MS outcomes like relapses. So this study was conducted in southern Tasmania near Australia and included 145 people with MS as well as multiple measurements of vitamin D status. So to kind of address some of the weaknesses of the former study, that included only one measure of vitamin D. And what they found was that people with higher levels of vitamin D, they had a lower number of relapses than people with lower levels of vitamin D. So kind of consistent with what the former study found, but expanding upon these findings since this was a much stronger study design. So those results that were observed in the Tasmanian study were replicated in larger studies, including over 400 people with MS, as well as a study that I worked on that included over 1,000 people with MS. And what they found in these two studies were consistent results for what they found both in the Tasmanian study as well as the study conducted in the original study conducted in the Netherlands. What they found was that higher levels of vitamin D, so this is how you interpret this graph. So as we move towards the right, these are lower levels of vitamin D, and then quintile 5 would be the highest levels of vitamin D. What they found was the people that had the highest levels of vitamin D had the lowest risk of developing a new lesion on an MRI. And so this was observed both in the study with the 400 individuals as well as the study including over 1,000 people with MS, where the individuals with the highest level of vitamin D had the lowest risk of developing a new lesion. It's important also to note that so far we've only been discussing are what we call cohort studies, or a type of observational study. So it's important to note the distinction of this type of studies and the strength of the conclusion that we can draw from the results. So what these types of studies is that we measure what people's exposure, so in this case what their vitamin D status is at that specific time. But this is important because we don't know why a person has that vitamin D level. Maybe he or she had been struggling with significant MS fatigue and stayed indoors more, and as a result had lower vitamin D levels, and this fatigue is what was contributing to the higher risk of MS outcomes. While many of these studies try to account for these factors, it's still not possible to completely rule out some of these potential biases. So we don't really know that the people with low vitamin D levels are actually comparable to the people with the higher vitamin D levels in this type of study design. We can try our best, but we don't know for sure. Ideally, a stronger study design is what we call a randomized study. So in this study, people receive a specific treatment randomly, like the flip of a coin. So in randomized studies of vitamin D, people are randomly allocated to either a high or a low dose, or a high dose of vitamin D supplementation, or no vitamin D supplementation based on the flip of a coin. So since we assigned the treatment randomly, so we assigned who gets vitamin D supplementation and who doesn't at random, we expect that the people in both of the groups are comparable on other things that could influence MS outcomes over time. And these include the measured as well as unmeasured factors. We expect those groups to be comparable. So back to our example, we expect things like the severity of MS-related fatigue that could influence vitamin D levels because of just staying indoors more. It would be distributed similarly between the two groups. So this study was a randomized study that kind of wanted to investigate more biological mechanisms. So why in the body could vitamin D supplementation affect some of the relevant MS-related disease processes. So it was a relatively small study that randomized 40 people to either receiving a high dose of vitamin D supplementation or a low dose of vitamin D supplementation. And they followed these individuals over the period of 6 months, and they wanted to measure how their immune cells changed associated with the vitamin D supplementation. And they wanted to see these specific immune cells are hypothesized contributors to the development of MS outcomes, including relapses or new lesions. So this study, of the 40 people, 35 people completed it, and what you can see in what these graphs are showing is that, as expected, the people who had the higher dose of vitamin D supplementation, they had a greater rise in their circulating vitamin D levels, suggesting that the people participating in the study were taking their supplements, and we can believe some of the results that are coming. So what they did find in this study was they found that the people who were randomized to the high dose of vitamin D supplementation, they experienced a reduction in some of the immune markers that are associated with greater inflammation. They also found that the people in the high dose vitamin D supplement group, they had a reduction, or they had an increase in the more regulatory immune cells. So the immune cells that are trying to control some of the inflammation. And what they found was that the reduction in the pro-inflammatory molecules and the increase in the regulatory immune cells, those were pretty well correlated, suggesting that the two processes were the two positive processes were going on at the same time. So there's been quite a few randomized studies of vitamin D supplementation in people with MS. A lot of them so far have been relatively small and couldn't make definitive conclusions, but there's been 2 studies that have been completed in the past couple of years that included a larger study populations and relatively longer follow-up time. So not a huge, a really long time, but longer than what had been done in the past. Both studies were investigating whether vitamin D supplement would be beneficial as an add-on to an MS medicine named the interferon beta. I do want to mention, though, that there are, in addition to these specific completed trials, there are a couple other trials that are ongoing with other MS medications as opposed to only interferon beta. So the first study I want to talk about was called the SOLAR trial. This was a trial taking place in Europe that evaluated vitamin D supplementation as an add-on to an MS medicine compared to the MS medicine only. So the MS medicine here was the interferon beta. So the primary outcomes, or the study's overall primary objective, was to see if vitamin D supplementation vitamin D supplementation could affect no evidence of disease activity. So in this context, they wanted to see if vitamin D supplementation helped prevent both new relapses or no relapses or new lesions. What they found was here highlighted at the top in the blue box was that they didn't find any difference between the two groups with respect to this measure of no evidence of disease activity. So it was a composite of no relapses as well as no new lesions. It's perhaps not unexpected given the size of the trial. It was larger than most of the studies ongoing right now, but it wasn't a large study. So this included around 200 individuals, whereas some large drug trials of large pharmaceutical trials of different MS medications, they include around 800, or each arm could include around 800 people. So it's relatively small when compared to a pharmaceutical trial. They did find that there was some positive evidence for some of the MRI measures. So consistent with what some of the observational studies were suggesting, they found the strongest association or relationship between vitamin D and the evidence of new MRI activity. So development of new lesions. Choline was another randomized trial that was also conducted primarily in Europe that evaluated the association or the effect of vitamin D supplementation on MS outcomes. Their primary outcome, or their primary objective, was to see whether vitamin D supplementation could affect the occurrence of new relapses. So this study included 129 people with MS who were randomized to either the high or the no, or high dose vitamin D supplementation or no vitamin D supplementation. 90 people out of the 129 completed the study. The adverse events, the study investigators didn't observe any type of bad occurrences that were associated with vitamin D supplementation. The study found that vitamin D supplementation did not appear to affect the relapse rate. So the occurrence of relapses was the same in the people who were randomized to vitamin D as well as the people who were randomized to placebo or no treatment. They did find, though, in a sub-analysis that in people who finished the trial, those people in the vitamin D group, they tended to have fewer new lesions. But it's hard to interpret these findings because we have to make sure that only 90 of the 129 people finished the study. And so we have to assume with these results that those 90 people were the same as the 129 people, when in reality they could be different. So they could be different, and those differences are contributing to why they now see an association between vitamin D and new lesions. So just to summarize about vitamin D and its effects on MS prognosis, some of the observational studies suggest that higher vitamin D levels are associated with lesser disease activity, and the most consistent results were observed for the MRI outcomes. So some large randomized trials of vitamin D supplementation have not been positive, but important to note, they also haven't been harmful. Some of the secondary MRI outcomes have suggested that vitamin D may have a beneficial may have a beneficial effect on some of the MRI measures, including development of new lesions. However, there's still a lot of stuff that we still don't know about vitamin D and its effect on MS prognosis. So most of these studies were lasted 2 years or less. When MS is a lifelong disease, so we really need to study the association between vitamin D and long-term MS outcomes. We're not sure if MS or if vitamin D has an impact on MS beyond new lesions. So in addition to new lesions, can vitamin D impact some of the measures related more to disability? They couldn't really comment on what's the optimal dose of vitamin D. We also have seen from some studies that people with MS, they could have a lower response to vitamin D supplementation. So this is kind of going along with what's the optimal dose of vitamin D for people with MS. If they have a lesser response, maybe they need more vitamin D than a person without MS. And they also studied, so far the studies have only looked at vitamin D as an add-on to interferon as an MS medicine, when it's possible that could have different effects with different MS medicines under study. So these are just some recommendations that I pulled from the MS Society of Canada's website, where it's recommended that adults with MS should have a recommended daily intake of vitamin D of 600 as the lower limit, up to 4,000 international units per day. And then if you're interested in learning more about vitamin D and MS, there is a comprehensive set of recommendations from an expert panel of MS experts, including neurologists, epidemiologists, and other vitamin D biologists, that's looked at the breadth of evidence for vitamin D as it relates to MS. So I encourage you to check those recommendations out. So right now we're done talking about vitamin D, and we're going to focus more on diet in itself, so more dietary patterns rather than a single component of diet, including like vitamin D. So we're going to do this through a couple different ways. So we're going to look at some common MS-related myths related to diet. We're going to review what we know about diet in MS, so what we do know, and some current studies on fasting style diets and Mediterranean diets, which are two specific diets that I've worked on. And lastly, we're going to provide some tips for eating well and eating easy in MS. So why do we care about diet and MS? Why diet be important in MS? And so we're going to discuss this from a couple different perspectives. So we're going to look at diet as it influences comorbid illnesses as they relate to MS outcomes. So there are some large, pretty well-conducted studies that suggest that having comorbid illnesses associated with that have been linked to diet, including obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, that people with MS who additionally have these comorbid illness, they tend to have worse MS outcomes relative to people who don't have those illnesses. We're lastly going to discuss the direct effect of diet on MS outcomes. So we're going to look at, are there specific components of the diet that directly impact some of the underlying MS disease-related processes. But first, we're going to talk about diet as it relates to obesity and diabetes and high blood pressure as they relate to MS outcomes. So excess weight in MS. So obesity or being overweight is considered a low-grade inflammatory state. And what you can see in this cartoon, so on the left we have the lean adipose tissue or fat tissue from a lean person as compared to adipose tissue from an obese person. What this picture is basically showing is that the adipose tissue of an an obese individual has been infiltrated by pro-inflammatory immune cells that produce markers in the blood that promote inflammation, whereas this isn't observed in the adipose tissue of a lean person. We also know that obesity itself is linked with MS. So obesity in childhood through early adulthood is associated with a higher risk of developing MS. But with that being said, we know that some MS symptoms, fatigue, depression, and some medications can also result in an unwanted weight gain in people with MS. We also know that patients classified as obese or overweight at their diagnosis have a greater risk of depression, lower functional capacity, and are at a higher risk for neurodegeneration relative to those classified as normal weight individuals. So in addition to obesity itself, other rates of weight-related comorbid illnesses like diabetes or high blood pressure could impact how MS changes over time. And what's being pictured here is it shows that the blue bars are the rates of these comorbid illnesses, including hypertension, hyperlipidemia, or hypertension or high blood pressure, high cholesterol or diabetes, before and after MS diagnosis. And what you can say is that the blue bar is before, orange bar is after. What you can see is an increase after diagnosis. So there are greater rates of high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and diabetes following an MS diagnosis. So why are we talking about this as it relates to diet? So we can capitalize on some measures or some results for studies in people without MS that suggest that having a healthy diet is associated with a lower risk of developing these diseases. So having a healthy diet is associated with a lower risk of being obese, getting diabetes, as well as having a high blood pressure. And what's pictured here are just two graphics of two diets that have a lot of evidence suggesting that they're beneficial for prevention of obesity, diabetes, or high blood pressure. So just to kind of demonstrate how many studies have investigated whether healthy diets could impact the risk of comorbid illness like diabetes, high blood pressure, or high cholesterol, I've kind of pulled the results from a bunch of different studies. And so how you can interpret these two plots is, so the straight vertical line right here, it is associated, so that's no association. So there's no association between the diet measure and then the risk of diabetes in the left-hand plot, or the risk of high heart disease in the right-hand plot. And how you interpret these are, so each individual line or each individual bar is one individual study. And so what you can find is that most of the studies find that having a healthy diet is associated with a lower risk of getting diabetes, as well as a lower risk of getting heart disease. So kind of suggesting that having a healthy diet can contribute to a lower risk of these comorbid illnesses that could contribute to poorer MS outcomes. So in addition to diet's effects on comorbid illnesses that might be relevant to poorer MS outcomes, diet itself could have an effect on some underlying MS-related disease processes. But first, when we talk about this, we're going to split it up into two kind of related components. We're going to look first at some common dietary myths about diet in MS. So there's a lot of information out there, but we want to filter down to what is really based on scientific research and what we can recommend to individuals. And then we're going to build upon, so what we don't know or what we can't say for certain right now, we're going to look at what we do know, so what research has been done concerning diet as it relates to MS. So as I mentioned before, there's lots of information on diet. So if you Google, is there a specific diet for MS, you might get a ton of different results that have probably conflicting messages. And so can we believe all of this information? So what do we know? So I've listed a couple common dietary myths, or that what I feel is a dietary myth that's not really based in that's not really supported by scientific evidence at this time. So it could very well be true down the line, but we don't know right now. We can't say for certain that this is a specific contributor. So the first one is go gluten-free or limit gluten consumption. So this is a quote from one specific article. So that said, if you're sensitive to gluten, it will cause widespread inflammation in the body. When people who are gluten intolerant eat these products, it can cause intestinal permeability, an inflamed response manifesting in ailments like leaky gut and irritable bowel syndrome. We'll explain a little bit what leaky gut is, because that's another common term that's associated with dietary myths. So some red flags associated with this statement are, it includes some simplistic conclusions that are drawn from a complex study. It uses a lot of pseudoscience jargon, including the leaky gut, which isn't a recognized term. So what we can take away from this is that MS does not make it necessary to limit or avoid gluten. If you choose to do so anyway, please be aware that there may be unintended consequences, and you should always speak to your healthcare team before making any dietary changes. So another common myth or term that's associated with diet and MS is the leaky gut. And so the leaky gut itself is not a clinically recognized diagnosis. While the gut or the microbiome is an exciting area of research, it's in its early stages. So the microbiome itself, it's a collection of microbes, including various bacteria, viruses, or protozoa that live inside your gastrointestinal tract. They help you metabolize the food that you eat, and they can also have some downstream effects. So this is kind of this is kind of the picture demonstrating communication of what's going on in your gastrointestinal tract from the activity of your gut microbiota and how that could relate to the brain. So for example, amino acids or markers or components of protein like tryptophan metabolites, they're metabolized by your gut microbiota, and then the metabolism produces these other molecules that can change the way some of your brain cells work. So it's a very exciting and interesting area of research, but it's just getting started. So there are some preliminary studies that show that people with MS may have a different composition of their gut microbiota relative to non-MS populations, but we can't say for certain right now what makes an favorable and unfavorable microbiome and what's the best approach to alter the microbiome. In other news, it's exciting, but there's still a lot to learn. So right now, as of the publication of this review paper, which was a couple of years ago, there had been 12 studies of looking at the gut microbiota as it relates to MS. It may look like it's like, wow, this has been a lot of work has been done. However, if you look at the numbers, they're still composed of small numbers of individuals who are on various disease-modifying therapies, and what you can find is that if you look at the actual results, they aren't finding consistent things across the study. And so some take-home messages are that they all were relatively small, most were cross-sectional, so they measured the microbiome at the same time as MS disease severity, so it's hard to know which is causing which, because it's possible that lack of activity or things that are greater burden of fatigue that could impact, that are MS-related symptoms could impact the diversity or the activity of some of your gut microbes. But we don't know that. And so I would say that the findings right now are relatively inconclusive. The next myth I wanted to discuss are that dairy products are unhealthy and bad for my MS. So actually, I think dairy products are an important food group because they have protein your body needs to help its organs work. Importantly, they also lots of time contain calcium that's helpful to strengthen bones. So we know that some research suggests that people with MS are at an increased risk of having lower bone density and of having hip fractures, which are associated with very poor outcomes. And so in people without MS, getting enough calcium can help prevent fractures and bone loss. Dairy products are often fortified with added vitamin D to help your body use this calcium, and since many Americans or Canadians don't get enough of these nutrients, this can help, or consuming dairy products can help with this. And then, as we discussed before, some studies show that having high enough vitamin D levels may help your MS directly. The next myth I wanted to discuss were that anti-inflammatory paleo vegetarian diets are always healthier and will help you lose weight. While there's definitely some research that suggests that a healthy vegetarian diet, such as one eating a plant-based focused eating plan, is associated with lower obesity, lower risk of developing high blood pressure or heart disease, so some of the comorbid illnesses that are associated with poor MS outcomes. However, just not eating meat itself will only contribute to weight loss if you reduce the total number of calories you take in. So some vegetarians could make food choices that could lead to weight gain, so replacing your meat with lots of processed foods or foods that are high in calories, fats, or saturated fats or sugar. I think importantly, one dietary myth that I think is that could be out there right now is that there is an MS specific diet. So unfortunately, I don't think there is, or we can say that at this time. So many diets have been proposed, but so far lots of the evidence is anecdotal, and some of the studies have been relatively small to know for sure. Research is currently ongoing and looking into many components of diets, and these include paleo diet, a very low fat diet, a plant-based diet, a Mediterranean, just an overall healthy eating plan, and a fasting style diet. So we're going to discuss a little bit of that in the future. So just to kind of reiterate that nutrition science and MS is an early stage, so not very many studies have been done. Some of them have been cross-sectional, so measuring diet and MS disease at the same time, so it's hard to know which causes which, or have been really relatively small or short in duration, so they didn't look. So since diet and MS are both long-term processes, it's hard to know that if changing your diet for 6 months or a very short amount of time can impact how MS changes over time in the long run. Just specifically, there have been a couple of different diets proposed, and I'm going to talk specifically about these three specific diets that have some studies or some underlying evidence that are looking at how these specific diets could impact underlying MS-related processes. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the high salt diet as it relates to some of the immune markers that are relevant to MS. So this group of studies was motivated by, in animal models, they found that a high salt diet can shift immune cells towards a more inflammatory profile. So they can also, so in animals as well as in cell-based or experimental models of MS, they can shift immune cells towards a reduction in more regulatory immune markers, an increase in more pro-inflammatory immune markers in various different types of immune cells. So it's kind of across the board. It's having a high salt diet was not good for, or was associated with promotion of inflammation in the models of MS. So these interesting lab-based studies in animals and cell-based models of MS, they found this strong relationship between high salt diets and changes in the immune cells. People are like, oh, well, we should investigate this in people with MS, because maybe we could say that having a high salt diet could contribute to downstream and specific MS-related outcomes. And this was investigated in a study of in a couple of different studies. So the first one was conducted in Argentina, It included 70 people with MS. They assessed sodium intake using a measure of, they measured it using urinary sodium excretion, which is an estimate of the amount of sodium that, or salt that an individual consumes. What they found was they found an association between the salt intake and relapse rates in this population, and they also found a cross-sectional association between higher levels of sodium intake and higher evidence of disease activity on the brain, so a higher burden of lesions in this population. However, the portion concerning the new lesions, that was a cross-sectional component, so it was only measured sodium excretion or intake of salt and the MRI outcomes at the same time, so it was hard to know if MS-related disease severity could impact an individual's dietary choices. So it's hard to tell from that specific study. And then a second study came out that was conducted in Northern California. It included 174 pediatric people with MS. It looked at whether dietary salt intake, so as opposed to dietary salt estimated from the urine, this one was estimated from a food frequency questionnaire. They did not find any association between dietary salt intake and the time to first relapse. So unlike the study that was conducted in Argentina, this larger study did not find any consistent results with respect to the association between dietary salt intake and any type of MS outcome. And their primary one looking at in this study was relapse rate. So, as a result, another larger study wanted to look even further as if dietary salt could contribute to other MS outcomes in a larger population of people with MS. And this is a study that I worked on pretty closely that looked at the intake of salt as measured in the urine, so similar to the Argentine study. Salt was estimated by urinary excretion of salt, which is kind of as a measure of their dietary intake. And what we found was that we did not see any association between higher levels of sodium. So on the right-hand side of each graph, those are the individuals with higher sodium levels. We didn't see any association between higher sodium levels and higher burden of lesion in the brain, higher burden of lesions in the brain, as well as the development of new lesions. So as you can see, the people in the right-hand side of the graph, they have a similar rate of lesions or lesion volume relative to the people on the left-hand side of the graph who have the lowest intake of salt. So kind of consistent more with the results of the California study in pediatric people with MS, and suggesting that perhaps there's no association between dietary salt intake and MS-specific outcomes. The next diet I would like to discuss is an intermittent fasting style diet. And so the intermittent fasting, or you can do this type of diet in a variety of different ways. One way is to do alternate day fasting, which I think would be very difficult, especially at least for me. So what this type of fasting method is that you eat normally for 1 day a week, and then the next day you fast, or you eat a very low calorie diet, and then the day after that you eat normally, and then the day after that you fast. So it's every other day you're fasting over the course of the year, over time. Another way is called the 5-2 diet, and so that's basically over the course of a week, 5 of the days you eat normally, you eat 100% of your calorie needs, and then 2 days of the week you fast, or you eat a drastically reduced calorie intake. And for this, this is usually, so if you're eating 2,000 calories a day, you eat 2,000 on Monday through Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday you eat only 500 calories. And you can either do those days in a row, or you can do them back to back, or you can do them interspersed throughout the week. The last way of doing a fasting style diet, or another common way of doing a fasting style diet, is called time limited eating, and that's where you eat all of your foods restricted to a specific window of time. So you only eat from 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. and then you fast from 8 p.m. on day 1 to 12 p.m. on day 2. So it's kind of, you have a period of an 8-hour eating window and a 16-hour fasting window. What's interesting specifically about these types of diets, they can show they not only benefit in terms of weight loss, but they also could benefit MS-related disease processes, and some of these are currently being researched right now. So just as an example of some of what we know from animal or cell-based studies of fasting models of MS, these are some of the hypothesized mechanisms for how fasting could impact MS-specific disease processes. And what you can see in the little box, fasting could help increase the production of regulatory immune cells, which is plotted in the top 2 box. It could also reduce pro-inflammatory immune cells, which is very interesting. And finally, fasting itself could help promote repair to specific brain cells in MS that are highly relevant to the disease process. So it can help promote remyelination, which is a really interesting kind of neat finding associated with fasting style diets, and really exciting because this is kind of showing that fasting or a specific type of diet can impact what's going on in your brain, which is very exciting. So as a result, we conducted a study that was looking at a pilot study looking at one type of fasting style diet in people with MS. So what we looked at was we enrolled 36 people with relapsing remitting MS. So we randomized people to 3 different dietary protocols. So one dietary protocol, individuals ate their normal diet, or they ate 100% of their calorie needs throughout the course of this 8-week study period. We randomized 12 people to an intermittent fasting style diet. So 5 days a week, the people ate 100% of their calorie needs, and then 2 days a week, they ate 25% of their calorie needs. So they had a drastic reduction of calories intake on those specific days. And then the last group of people, they were randomized to a daily calorie restriction. So this was just a little bit of calories reduced each day. So this is kind of similar to if you were to go on a diet, and what most people think about when they think, oh, I'm going to go on a diet, I'm going to eat a little bit less each day, and over the long run, that will contribute to weight loss. So we had these 3 groups. So just to reiterate, we had one group of control diet, so they ate the same amount of calories that they were eating before the study began, and intermittent fasting, so 5 days a week they ate normally, and then 2 days a week they had a drastically reduced calorie intake. And then the last group, which was a little bit reduced, but a little bit was reduced each day. What we found was interesting that both the calorie restriction diet, so our intermittent fasting diet, and then the daily calorie restriction diets, each were associated with a significant change in weight, but we didn't see any difference between the 2 diets, between the 2 different types of calorie restriction diets. We found also interesting that randomization to either of the calorie restriction diet was associated with improvements in mood. And so these are just kind of some graphs of what we found from this study. So on the left-hand side, that's looking at the change in weight that occurred over the study. So weight loss was observed for both types of calorie restriction, so the fasting as well as the daily, so a little bit reduced each day. But they didn't differ with respect to weight loss. So how much weight people lost wasn't significantly different between those 2 types of dietary calorie restriction. We did find that, as you might expect, fasting was harder for participants to complete. So what we found was that the differences in adherence, so people randomized to the fasting style diet, they tended to eat on average around 100 calories more on those fasting days relative to what we recommended they follow. Importantly, though, I think take-home messages, because this is a really a small study, it was a pretty short in duration, it was only over an 8-week period. What we found was significant improvements in mood for both calorie restriction groups. So the people that had that followed the intermittent fasting protocol, or the people that had a little bit of calories reduced each day, over the course of the study, those people tended to feel better, to have an improvement in their mood, and relative to the people who just had no change in their diet, or no change in their diet. The ketogenic diet is another type of fasting mimicking diet. So it's basically, you can follow it by consuming. You don't have to fast, but you have to eat a diet that's very high in fat, very low in carbohydrates, that kind of in your body can introduce a fasting mimicking state. So dietary restriction is known to result in increased production of what are called ketone bodies. So these are specific type of molecule in the blood that can be used as an energy source in the context of limited glucose. So typically your brain will use glucose or a type of sugar as an energy source, but in the context of very low glucose, your brain can use these things called ketone bodies. And this is what we call a shift to ketogenesis. And why might we be interested in the ketogenic diet in MS? This was motivated by findings in the mouse forms of MS that found that in mice following the ketogenic diet, they tended to have lesser disability and develop fewer lesions. The ketogenic diet also helped to suppress inflammation and enhanced repair of brain cells, which were interesting findings that helped motivate some studies of the ketogenic diet in people with MS. So this study was a pilot study of 20 people with relapsing remitting MS. It was a single arm trial, so it was everybody, all 20 people, started the ketogenic diet, or a modified Atkins diet, as a type of ketogenic-like diet. It's a little bit less restrictive. To participate in this study, participants met with a dietitian on how to introduce this modified Atkins diet to their lifestyle. And then what this study did was measured changes in anthropometric characteristics, like changes in weight, changes in body mass, as well as changes in fatigue and depression severity. And so these are a description of the results of this study. What they found was the introduction of this modified ketogenic-like diet resulted in a significant reduction in weight, waist circumference, and body fat. They found a significant reduction in depressive symptoms, as well as a significant reduction in fatigue severity. So kind of consistent with what we found in our study of a different type of calorie restriction type, or a fasting style diet. They kind of saw the same thing. So changes in weight, changes in depression symptoms, suggesting that these types of diets might be beneficial for MS symptoms, some of the MS symptoms. They weren't both of those studies, so they weren't long enough to be able to comment on specific MS-related disease processes. So, wrapping up the fasting style diets, we do need to discuss a little bit of some considerations before you jump right into to following this type of diet. So you really should consult with your doctor before starting. Some of your other medications might need to be adjusted. Some of the reported common side effects for these types of diets are increased hunger, fatigue, and dizziness. You probably shouldn't start this type of diet if you have a history of a disordered eating, tendency to binge, or are pregnant or nursing or planning to become pregnant. And it's likely that children or teenagers should not follow this type of diet. So the last type of diet study that I'm going to discuss that with respect to MS is a modified Mediterranean diet. And so this study that has been examined in people with MS. So this study looked at a modified Mediterranean diet in 36 people with relapsing remitting MS. So this study recommended individuals to follow a Mediterranean style diet for 6 months that was delivered through educational sessions. So the participants in this study met with study dietitians to learn about how to follow a specific diet and how to follow the Mediterranean style diet. And in these sessions, participants were encouraged to increase intake of fish and other foods high in poly and monounsaturated fats. So fresh fruits, encouraged vegetable intake and whole grains, and suggested participants eliminated some of the meat products and processed food. So like the previous fasting style diets in people with MS, the study was pretty small. It couldn't make conclusions about the effects on diet on specific MS outcomes, like developing new lesions or new relapses, but it did evaluate the effects of this type of diet on changes in weight, changes in fatigue, or changes in depressive symptoms. And these are some of the results from the shift in the diet. So how can you follow a Mediterranean diet? So I couldn't find any Canadian specific recommendations, but the U.S. has U.S. Dietary Guidelines has guidelines for following a North American style modified Mediterranean diet, and you can find them on this website here, and it kind of shows you that your targeted calorie range and then how many servings of these specific types of foods you should be eating each day. And kind of just to summarize what these actually are. So this Mediterranean style diet, they recommend trying to prioritize vegetables, fruits, whole grains, fish, olive oil, or other polyunsaturated fats, things like canola or rapeseed oil, as well as intake of nuts and seeds, but to make sure to watch out for portion size because those tend to be very calorically dense. You're trying to prioritize that group of foods and then trying to limit foods that are high in saturated fats, empty calories or added sugars, and then highly processed foods. So foods that have undergone like lots of different processing, like hydrogenation, hydrolysis, reshaping, pre-processing by pre-frying, those types of highly processed foods where lots of the nutrients have been removed. So, consistent with recommendations from the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, these are some recommendations from various societies representing several of the organizations for chronic diseases that are associated with MS outcomes. So as you can see, lots of these recommendations are very consistent with what the U.S. Dietary Guidelines suggest for following a modified Mediterranean diet, in that should emphasize intake of colorful vegetables and fruits, lean proteins, beans, legumes, nuts, and seeds, whole grains, healthy fats, while limiting saturated fats, added sugars, and highly refined foods. The Canadian Dietary Guidelines for Healthy Eating also have some kind of distinct and I think helpful recommendations, suggesting that healthy eating is more than the foods that you eat. It's also about when, where, and why and how you eat. So to be mindful of your eating habits, take time to eat and notice when you are hungry or full, cook more often, enjoy your food. Cultural and food traditions can be a big part of healthy eating, as well as to eat meals with others. So consistent with the recommendations from the US and then those organizations for the chronic diseases, they want to make it a habit to eat a variety of healthy food each day, eat plenty of vegetables and fruits, whole grains, and lean protein foods, limit highly processed food, and try to make water your drink of choice. So replacing sugary drinks with water, and then to finally also be aware that food marketing can influence your dietary choices. So this is probably a little bit difficult to read, but there are several ongoing trials of different diets in MS, just to demonstrate that we still have a lot to learn, but we're trying to move forward. And these are kind of each of the specific diets, what they're interested, or each of the specific diet studies, what they're interested in, and the types of measures they're getting from the conduct of these studies. And so this extends on to the next page. Just to kind of highlight that diet's a new field, diet in MS is a relatively new field, so we don't have all the answers, but we're trying to make strides to have a more definitive answer. So just to summarize and conclude, today we talked about the importance of maintaining an adequate vitamin D status. We reviewed some of the studies that have been going on about the importance of vitamin vitamin D as it relates to some of measures of MS prognosis. We also talked about how diet could influence MS prognosis through many different ways, including comorbidity or directly. So diet may be important we talked about how diet may be important from prevention of comorbidity. From that perspective, many of the specific diet studies have been small, or they've measured diet and disease outcomes at the same time, or cross-sectional study. We also noted that several of the completed types of specific diets are ongoing, but most are small and relatively short in duration, and they also don't measure the effect of these specific diets on MS-related outcomes, like new lesions or the development of new relapses or changes in disability status. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention and your time, and I had a really great time preparing this presentation, and my time in Saskatoon has been very, very nice. Thanks for your attention, and good night.